He was the heavyweight champion of the world, but 90% of his earnings were already gone, signed away to managers, promoters, even a man he knocked out. Joe Louis didn't fight in the ring, he fought a system built to own him.
Before Joe Louis became a symbol of black excellence and national pride, he was just another gifted fighter trying to survive the racial labyrinth of 1930s America. In Detroit, a young Louis found himself under the wing of two black businessmen who saw more than just fists, they saw a way out. John Roxborough, a local bookmaker, and Julian Black, a Chicago area promoter, were savvy, street smart, and determined to do what most black handlers never could: manage a champion without surrendering power to white management. They built a team. They hired Jack "Chappie" Blackburn as Louis's trainer. They kept the operation black owned, black managed, and black guided in an era when that kind of control was almost suicidal in the business of boxing. Louis debuted professionally on July 4th, 1934, knocking out Jack Kraken for a measly $59, the equivalent of $1,148.60 in 2020. Even by the standards of the day, it was chump change compared to what white fighters could command. But from that meager purse, a star began to rise. Louis won all 12 of his fights that year, 10 by knockout. In September 1934, while promoting a coming home bout in Detroit against Canadian Alex Borchuk, Roxborough was confronted by members of the Michigan State Boxing Commission. They were clear: if Louis wanted to take his career to the next level, he'd have to be signed under white management. It wasn't just racism, it was about access. Black promoters weren't allowed to cash in like their white counterparts. Roxborough and Black were cornered, and they knew it. While professional boxing wasn't officially segregated, many white Americans did not like the idea of a black man beating white opponents, especially not in the heavyweight division. These weren't just fights, they were cultural earthquakes. In 1908, Jack Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion. His dominance, defiant attitude, and marriage to a white woman sparked violent riots across America. White promoters and officials swore it would never happen again. Johnson was hounded out of the country and spent years avoiding U.S. soil just to keep fighting. So when Joe Louis started rising, handlers knew they had to play it differently. If Louis were to become a national figure, he needed insulation, not just from the press, but from anti-black violence. That's where Mike Jacobs came in. In 1935, Jacobs, a cunning white promoter with mob ties and deep connections, sought out Louis's handlers. After Louis's narrow victory over Natty Brown on March 29th, they met at the Frog Club, a black nightclub. There they struck a 3-year exclusive promotion deal, but the ink on that contract wasn't even dry before Roxborough and Black moved in again. When Louis turned 21 on May 13, 1935, they locked him into long-term personal management contracts that guaranteed each of them 25% of all future earnings. Half his fortune spoken for before he'd even fought for a title. They also rebranded him. Learning from Jack Johnson's downfall, Roxborough and Black created the 7 Commandments, strict behavioral rules designed to make Louis palatable to white America: never have his picture taken with a white woman, never gloat over a fallen opponent, never engage in fixed fights, live and fight clean. It was a media campaign disguised as morality, a leash on a man already surrounded. In June 1936, Joe Louis suffered his first professional loss at the hands of Germany's Max Schmeling. Schmeling wasn't just better that night, he was surgical. He'd studied Louis obsessively, dissected his flaws, and exposed them for the world to see. Louis hit the canvas again and again, unprepared for the precision of a man fighting not just for victory, but for a regime back home. Schmeling was already being embraced by Nazi Germany as a symbol of Aryan supremacy. Though he never officially joined the Nazi Party, he took photographs with Adolf Hitler and became a darling of the propaganda machine. Nazi fanatics loved him, and Schmeling didn't resist the spotlight. The loss crushed Louis and complicated the heavyweight title picture. Schmeling had earned a shot at the belt. He was now the clear #1 contender. But what followed wasn't about rankings. After Braddock's shocking upset over maxbaerjr, Madison Square Garden, MSG, locked him into a contract to defend the title under their promotion. They expected Braddock Schmeling to be next. and so did the rest of the world. But Mike Jacobs and Braddock's manager Joe Gould had other plans. They had been quietly negotiating a Braddock-Lewis matchup for months. Schmeling's victory had given Gould serious leverage, and he used it like a knife. He told Jacobs that if they didn't meet his demands, he'd hand the fight to Schmeling. And with the Nazi regime behind him, Lewis might never get another shot. So Jacobs caved. He agreed to pay Braddock and Gould 10% of all future profits from Lewis's boxing promotions for 10 years. Not just from the title fight, from everything Lewis did going forward. Braddock would get rich, win or lose. MSG tried to stop the fight, they sued, but Jacobs moved the bout to Chicago, where the New York State Athletic Commission had no jurisdiction. A federal court later ruled that Braddock's contract with MSG was unenforceable, and just like that, the path was clear, the puppet strings were yanked, Schmeling was frozen out, Lewis was in. Behind the patriotic headlines and flag waving, this was a backroom heist, and Joe Louis was both the prize and the pawn. June 22nd, 1937, Chicago. In front of thousands, James Braddock knocked Louis down in the first round, but it didn't last. By the 8th, Louis landed a right hand that shattered Braddock's mouth. The Cinderella man crumpled. Louis was now the heavyweight champion of the world. Black America exploded with joy. Langston Hughes wrote that every Louis win felt like a win for every black man in America. But beneath the celebration was a cruel twist. For the next decade, Braddock quietly collected 10% of Louis' promotional profits, over $150,000, equivalent to millions today. He never had to fight again. And Max Schmeling, the Nazi favorite who had already beaten Louis, was cast aside. Ironically, Schmeling never supported Hitler's ideology, but he played the part. He posed for photos with Hitler, gave interviews, smiled when they needed him to. He used the Nazi machine for exposure, then that same machine turned on him when he lost.
Joe Louis had the title, but at a cost that he never agreed to. The story was no longer about victory, it was about control.
With the title secured, Joe Louis was no longer just a boxer. He was a national symbol. During World War II, he was paraded out in front of cameras, punching Nazis in posters, and headlining charity exhibitions to raise war bonds. He raised millions for the U.S. military, all while serving in segregated units, saluting a flag that didn't yet salute him back. What the public didn't see was the fine print. Louis was donating entire purses willingly, they were told, but no one mentioned the taxes. The IRS taxed him as if he had pocketed every cent. The free exhibitions turned into a financial death sentence. By the time he returned from the war, Louis returned home to a financial nightmare. Despite earning millions in the ring, Louis owed the government more than $500,000, a staggering amount, compounded by interest and penalties. His managers, his promoters, and even the military brass had walked away clean. He was left holding the debt, much of it due to unpaid taxes, interest, and mismanagement. His returns had been handled by Jacobs' personal accountant, and not well. Even as he fought for America abroad, the 10% to Braddock kept coming out. By the end of the 1940s, Louis had earned over $4.6 million, but after managers, promoters, taxes, and fees, he saw just $800,000 of it, and it was slipping away fast.
The American media turned Louis into a living myth, a war hero with a left hook, but behind the scenes he was suffocating. Every fight he took from then on wasn't for glory, it was for survival. He wasn't fighting opponents anymore, he was fighting debt, exhaustion, and the system.
Desperate, Louis returned to the ring. In 1946, he fought Billy Conn again, a rematch that brought him a $600,000 payday. But it wasn't enough. His managers took $140,000, his ex-wife took $66,000, New York State took another $30,000, the IRS took the rest. By the late 1940s, Louis's body was breaking down, and so was his spirit. But the machine he was powering didn't care. By 1950, Louis owed more in taxes than he could ever pay. With a 90% tax rate on new earnings, even his comeback fights couldn't keep pace with the interest on his debt. Mike Jacobs was still collecting, Braddock was still cashing checks, Roxborough and Black had faded into the shadows, but their early contracts still haunted Louis's finances. Every time he stepped in the ring, a portion of his earnings vanished, swallowed by ghosts. The government even seized the $667 his mother left him when she died. In 1949, Louis retired, but the IRS didn't. He was forced to come back in 1950, older, slower, and no longer invincible. He wasn't the Brown Bomber anymore. He was just a name, and names make money. Promoters rushed to milk whatever was left of the legend. They fed him lesser opponents, padded his record, and sold nostalgia to desperate fans. But the moment he faltered, the moment he was vulnerable, they turned. October 26, 1951. Joe Louis stepped into the ring against a young, brutal Rocky Marciano. It wasn't a fair fight. Marciano knocked him through the ropes. As Louis lay tangled and broken, Marciano stood back, almost apologetic. He knew he had just beaten a ghost. The crowd wept, not for the loss, but for what Louis had become, a living monument to a past he no longer controlled. He didn't retire that night. He vanished. He fought exhibitions. He appeared on quiz shows. He even took a job greeting tourists at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. And in his final years, the people around him faded, except for two unlikely friends. Max Schmeling, the man who beat him, the man once beloved by the Nazis, quietly paid off Louis's debts. He gave him financial help when no one else would.
Another benefactor, Harlem drug kingpin Frank Lucas. He once paid off a $50,000 bill just because he thought Louis had been wrong. The system used Louis, and when it was done with him, it left him in ruins. But not everyone forgot him.
What does it mean to be a champion when you die in debt? Joe Louis, the man who brought black and white Americans to cheer under the same roof, who defeated Nazi symbols and unified a nation at war, died owing more money than he ever had. In his final years, he worked as a greeter at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, shaking hands with gamblers who barely recognized him. The casino paid him a salary not out of charity, but because he still drew attention. Even in decay, Louis had value to the people around him. He was a pawn from beginning to end. The people who said they loved him, they let him rot. The nation that celebrated his fists, it forgot his name when his hands stopped working. Some said Joe Louis bought the title, but that was never true. It was never his to buy. From the beginning, the title and everything that came with it was brokered, sold, and harvested by the men around him. Roxborough, Black, Jacobs, Gould, Braddock, even the US government, they all got paid. Joe Louis was the greatest heavyweight of his era, but greatness in America is never free. Joe Louis died on April 12, 1981 in Las Vegas. Hours earlier, he'd watched one last championship fight, Holmes versus Berbick. President Ronald Reagan waived the rules so Louis could be buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. One of his pallbearers, Max Schmeling, the so-called Nazi hero who had once stood across the ring from him, and later stood by him when it mattered most.
In the end, Joe Louis was more than a fighter. He was a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a man who gave more than he ever got back. He didn't just pay the price of glory, he lived it with interest. And that's all I got for you. Don't forget to drop a like, a subscribe, a comment, and share. Do all that good stuff for me. Until next time.